Without written records, we're often blind to the intrapsychic realities, the intentions and beliefs of peoples of the deep past. For Mesopotamia, writing doesn't enter the picture until around 3200 BC, which is late into the Rook Period, which started around 600 years prior. And even that writing isn't mature. It's a system of accounting for objects through their depictions along with the given amount of that object. They soon use their symbols in more complex ways, using the sounding out of the objects depicted to leave behind the object and have the symbol represent the sound rather than the object, and combining multiple sounds gave them a way to write people's names as well as other words, though only in the following Early Dynastic Period would this be put to use to write historical records and other forms of meaningful intrusions into these human psyches. That means that knowing explicit worldviews and thoughts are often impossible, and at times even things as basic as reading a given temple as belonging to a given god the city is known to have worshipped later on can be brought under scrutiny. The space for doubt and debate aside, let's tentatively wade into the early history of Mesopotamia. When Mesopotamian civilization went through the final thrust that brought it from increasingly powerful urban centers reaching up to towns of a couple of thousand people, up to places where there are multiple proper city-states along with large palaces and temples and corresponding power, that happened in southern Mesopotamia with the story many of us have glimpses of with familiar city names like Uruk of the famed Gilgamesh epic and as well as less famous cities like Nippur, which housed the Sumerian chief deity, and Lil, ruler of the cosmos, in whose hands one prayed the Tablet of Destinies would remain. And there were also other city-states, such as the long-term warring with each other, Umma and Lagash. Southern Mesopotamia becoming the center of a major city-state-based civilization is a bit of a surprise historically speaking, because up till it occurring, no such organization of human beings had ever existed, as best we yet know. That said, emergent systems of higher-order human group organization had been occurring for a while already, and to the southwest in particular, Egypt may well have had kings before Mesopotamia, and Egyptian pharaohs ruled a much larger domain than the early Mesopotamian kings. But the population was far less densely distributed in early Egypt for cities to play the central early role they played in Mesopotamia. And even if you'd looked around and gotten suspicious that something was up, if you'd looked around and noticed that increasing specialization and social stratification were happening, and that much larger populations were being maintained, and you'd guessed that some new tipping point was about to be reached, southern Mesopotamia wouldn't have been your first choice. If you had looked around from the start of sedentary communities around 14,500 years ago in the Levant, through the rise of farming starting up about 11,000 years ago, and its subsequent spread through much of the Near East, on through the increasing social stratification evidenced in the Ube Period, which runs from 8,500 years ago on through 5,800 years ago, or 3,800 BC, which marks the advent of the Uruk Period, in which Uruk would come to see a major rise. But up until the Uruk Period, you wouldn't have likely guessed that this is where the future came from. For much of the time in question, you probably would have assumed that up in the northwest, in Turkey and Syria, you might see the realization of whatever this great urbanizing stirring was whirling into being. You can think of the monumental architecture of Göbekli Tepe up north in South Turkey, the greatest demonstration of organized labor up to that point. Though initially, after the early excavations there, thought to have been created by non-sedentary people, further excavation has brought to light domestic residences, domestic tools, hearths, as well as burials. Later on in southern Turkey as well, the developments related to farming and rise of group size and density brought about the Great Çatalhöyük. Up until the Ube period, however, named after the Ubaid site of southern Mesopotamia, human communities didn't show signs of serious social stratification. In the Ubaid, however, some graves and homes start bearing testimony to wealthy individuals, and villages are clustering around the larger urbanizing regional centers. Ubaid-style pottery is found distributed rather widely up north in Turkey, Iran, and from at least 60 sites in the Arabian Peninsula, and oftentimes pottery style isn't the only Ubaid cultural element found at these sites. A notable southern Mesopotamian town is that of Eridu, which came to house around 3,000 people, and a 260 square meter temple, assuming it's actually a temple. The north isn't lacking in this unfolding social stratification story, and numerous sites bring similar signs of differently sized homes as well as gravegood disparity, and it may show clearer signs in the south of social stratification and organization, common hallmarks of urbanization. Perhaps most notable is the appearance of the stamp seal, thought to be owned by emergent elites that are found used at Tel Zaydan, Hamilcar, and Tel Brak in the north, before any sign of the later cylinder seals in the south. Further, Tel Zaydan, having around 3,000 people by around 5000 BC, has large pottery kilns for mass pottery production and is one of the earlier copper smelters, acquiring copper through trade with Anatolia and smelting it at Tel Zaydan. In the Uruk period, a certain place in southern Mesopotamia, named Uruk at a certain point, became the most urbanized settlement in the Near East and in fact the world. It's in the later Uruk period that we see the most development and the population rises to some 25,000 people, possibly higher. Uruk culture spreads to varying degrees in Upper Mesopotamia, Turkey, Syria, Iran, and the Arabian Peninsula, and there's even evidence of spread into Egypt with Egyptian usage of Mesopotamian architectural style and Egyptian depictions of Mesopotamian ships. Some of the sites across Upper Mesopotamia and into the reaches of Syria, Turkey, and Iran were actual outposts of Urukians. The extent to which Urukians themselves spread out is debated, and the extent to which Urukian culture leaves its imprint at other sites varies. As for outposts themselves, these took different forms. Some areas settled hadn't seen settlement prior to the Urukians planting themselves there, and others saw settlement continue once some Urukians joined alongside. Warfare was seemingly another option, as from around 3500 BC comes what might be the earliest evidence of warfare in the Near East, with the likely siege and definite destruction of Hamilcar. The subsequent construction at the site, as well as the cultural artifacts, are Urukian. What the nature of leadership in Uruk was remains unknown, though the most common argument is for a priest-king of sorts, thought to be depicted in the many instances we have of this dude who sometimes appears clothed and sometimes naked. The Uruk period saw developments in agriculture, most notably with the introduction of the plow. They also saw developments in pottery, primarily through the pottery wheel, which increased production and also saw a marked shift from the more decorative pottery styles we'd seen prior. The Uruk period also presumably saw developments in the evolution of authority, and cylinder seals came on board. Whatever the nature of rulership, Uruk saw two major temples constructed: Eanna, also known as the Temple of Inanna, and the other being to Anu. The Temple of Eanna marked a more than 15-fold increase from the largest prior temple of the region of Eridu. The later, or perhaps End-Urukian, saw a collapse of Urukian prominence and regional cultures asserted themselves. Debate surrounds whether to identify the coming around 200 years, the tail end of the Uruk period, or the Jemdet Nasser period named after a nearby site. It wasn't long, however, before the new system of the South took shape, and we find ourselves in a world of oft-conflicting city-states. The Mesopotamian city-states of the Early Dynastic Period grew close by to one another. They each housed one or more gods to whom they had significant temples. Kings ruled their city-state and at times warred with their neighbors. From around 2500 BC, we start recovering records informing us about diplomatic realities along with warfare. In the south, we have the largest archive from Lagash, along with some other small collections of writings, and along with Lagash, up north in Syria, the state of Ebla contributes the other major early archive. From Lagash, we learn of the sustained wars between Umma and Lagash, at times over a disagreement about who rightfully controlled the Gu Adina, a land along their borders, or within their borders, if you ask them. Less local wars occurred as well, including the Lagash defeat of Mari and Elam around 2450 BC. The king's estates were vast, and they, along with the temples, were the largest property holders and animal owners around. And they were correspondingly the biggest employers of the cities. As the early dynastic period neared an end, a number of kings had begun to think of themselves as rightful rulers of all the land, though they'd only managed the successful capture of a couple of cities. But around 2358, the king of Uruk and Umma, Lugal-Zaghazi, conquered most of southern Mesopotamia. With this trend underway, our story comes to a close as we reach the year 2334 BC when Sargon became king of Agade, or Akkad.